This is Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.
Good morning. This is Carl Hartman coming to you on 106.1, the Flip FM, for another episode of Cogitations. I hope on this December 24th, this Christmas Eve, that you are full of joy, that you have plans with family and with friends. And if you don't, I encourage you to make some plans, to just find something to plug into, to maybe give you a little lightness to life. I know one thing that we commonly do when we find ourselves actually at home and not traveling to visit somebody on Christmas is we'll invite people over who may not, like ourselves, have somewhere to particularly go. And we'll already be having a house full tomorrow of people that were just going to be staying in town and for whatever reason wasn't going out to visit with family and friends anywhere. And so that really brings a little bit of joy and happiness to share that day with some other people. So as we're on the cusp of Christmas Day, I wanted to give a little bit of thought to that day. This is a time of year where a lot of people's minds have been turned to thinking about Jesus. And you see people with shirts, he's the reason for the season. You see people with shirts, happy birthday, Jesus. I saw a young lady the other day wearing that, and we actually got in a little conversation. And last year, I spent the time during the program around Christmas talking about the actual sequence of events with the birth of Jesus. And I'm going to kind of highlight that this year and then go into talking about some other things related to this holiday season when it comes to just our focus, not only during this time of year, but what that focus should be year-round. Now, of course, we find the birth of Jesus covered in Luke chapter 2. And I'm not going to read all of this event, but I want to highlight a few things for our understanding. And all these things, I mean, you can research and know. It's a matter of just some of it historical fact and some of it just accuracy of what the scriptures actually say. But we find in the opening of Luke chapter 2 that it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So the census that required Joseph, along with his bride Mary, to go to Bethlehem, we get some markers here. Well, it's a census that took place when Augustus was Caesar. Also, we get another hint, Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Well, historically, we can look back, and there's records that have been maintained since those ancient times that tell us that this particular census took place in May, June, and July. May, June, July, not in December. Also, you see, May, June, July, summertime, December's wintertime, and we find that in the account of Luke, you have those shepherds. They're just staying out in the field overnight. They wouldn't do that in the winter. In the winter, they'd be bringing the animals in and sheltering them during the cold nights. So we find them coming in May, June, or July. And we can narrow that down a little bit more, and maybe I'll talk about that when we flip over to Matthew briefly. Another thing to understand is where they were at. As we talked about a year ago, and you can actually go to the Cogitations YouTube channel, go back and get that full episode. They weren't out in some barn. They weren't out in some lean-to. They were actually in a house. The language that we get as manger, or some translations trough, manger is more accurate. That's actually a floorboard in a house that you could lift up and move, and it was pretty sizable. Some of them be about 4 foot by 4 foot or even bigger. And that's so in the wintertime, in the cold months, those animals you kept around the house, like maybe the goat you got milk from, those animals you would bring inside. And you would lift that floorboard and move it out of the way so those animals have hay to eat and or to lie in. And so you'd have that manger there, packed full of straw. Remember, a trough, that's for water, not for hay, generally speaking, although we may slop the pigs in a trough. So they're in a house. And the inn, there's no room in the inn, and it translates in our English language. That's a loft. And the loft in the house is generally where people slept, as opposed to the common area downstairs where they would cook and eat and maybe work. And so these folks probably had a lot of relatives and a lot of acquaintances coming to town, because everybody basically of the family of David, going back to King David, had to come to Bethlehem. So you have all these cousins and nephews and nieces and everybody coming there to satisfy the census. And so when Joseph and Mary come to some relative's house, well, the loft is full already. So since the animals are being kept outside for warmer months, hey, why don't you all use the manger? You can just lie in a bed of hay. We see that because when the shepherds actually come, verse 12, they're told, and this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, laying in a manger. And when they do show up in verse 16, and some English translations butcher this a little bit, some do not, and they came with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. So note the language there. They found Mary and Joseph and the baby all lying in a manger. And that's because it's that large section of flooring that could move that was packed with hay, not some little trough that was only big enough to put little baby Jesus in. And so this is where they are found. And this is the scene that we see here in the biblical text and the historical accuracy. Flipping back over to Matthew, and just hitting some highlights there again, just so we're accurate in our understanding of these events instead of how it gets retold many times. And so we turn over to Matthew chapter 2, and this is not the birth of Christ. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. So this is after the birth of Jesus. And initially in this chapter, it doesn't tell us how long after, but it's after. It's not when Jesus was born. Jesus has already been born when these events in Matthew chapter 2 take place. And it's right there in the opening of the story of the wise men from the east, after Jesus was born. Okay? So after Jesus was born, there's wise men that came from the east, and they came to Jerusalem. See, they didn't go straight to Bethlehem because they come looking for a king. And that's what they proclaim in verse 2. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? So they're coming because they're looking for a king of the Jews. And the king of the Jews would be in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the capital of the Jews. And Jerusalem is where the current king is residing. Herod was currently the puppet king of the Jews. And so Herod hears about this. Herod asks his scribes in verse 4, what are these guys talking about? The scribes quote in verse 6 from the prophet saying Bethlehem. So they knew Bethlehem's where he's going to be born. So the Magi planned to go to Bethlehem to find this king who had been born already born. They're coming after the fact. And so Herod takes them to the size, to the side. Verse 7 of Matthew 2, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. So he pulls them to the side. Hey, when did the sign appear that directed you to come over here to find this king? So he determines from them. But note that later on in the passage, verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, because he told the wise men, hey, when you find him, come back and let me know where he is so I can come and pay homage to him as well. But that wasn't Herod's plan, and the wise men get warned by God about Herod's plan, so they don't go back to Herod. Okay? And so Herod's mad, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. See, the wise men are showing up 2 years later. That's the time. Hey, we saw this sign 2 years ago, made preparations, and made the journey here. Remember, they're not hopping on a plane and flying 14 hours to get to the other side of the world, or 8 hours to get across several countries. No, they got to make preparations for a long journey, pack up their camels and their caravans, and begin the long trek across hills, mountains, deserts to get from the east of Jerusalem to Jerusalem. And so 2 years, and we see it in the text. If you go through and read the text, you note you don't ever find baby there. You find child, and the actual Greek is toddler, and they go to the house. See, at this point, they probably are planning on staying in Bethlehem. They've already either built their own house. After all, Joseph's a carpenter, or they have purchased a house or are renting a house. And so there they are. The wise men go to the house. Another fun thing to note is we always say 3 wise men. Read through that text and put your finger on the word 3. It's not there. We don't know how many wise men there were. And the gifts are categories, not just number, but there's 3 different categories of gifts. So I'm going to stop there. That's just kind of a highlight. And if you really want to get into more detail, you can go back to the episode last year, and you can find that on Cogitations YouTube channel. You can also go over to Spotify. They're up there as well on Spotify, and you can go and listen to that. But all that said, there's still nothing wrong. The scriptures tell us that we are to, either we respect the day or we don't. Let every man have his holy day, Paul wrote in Romans. So if one guy wants to keep a day as special, that's fine. And if another person wants to count every day equally special, that's fine as well. So don't let that little facts deter you from engaging in some thought about Jesus during this time of year. But this is a great time of year to become aware of what's going on around you. Hopefully everybody who is listening to this broadcast, whether you're listening to it on the day in which it aired or you're listening to it later on the YouTube channel or on Spotify, I encourage you, I hope that you are joyous and that you're happy, that you're surrounded by loved ones who care about you, and that you're enjoying this time together. But there are a lot of folks that this time of year is not a happy time of year. Some folks have suffered losses in the past this time of year. Some people might be struggling financially and can't do for their family as they would like to do. So I encourage folks to always be to have their eyes open, their ears tuned to what's going on around them. And when you see someone who's downtrodden, when you see someone who's struggling, do what you can to help them. The scriptures tell us to do good unto all men, especially the household of faith. And a lot of times we want to focus on that, especially the household of faith, and forget the people that are outside the body of Christ. But the beginning of that is to do good unto all. Think of Jesus. Think of Jesus' life in the flesh. His life, and particularly that 3-ish year ministry, he was constantly ministering to people. And a lot of times he was ministering to people who had been marginalized, people who had been beggars for most of their life, yet he heals them and restores them. I really like to think about the lady at the well. You have this Samaritan woman, and if you go and you read that section there, as the disciples are heading out of the region of Judea, and they're going to be going to Galilee. Well, between Galilee and Judea, and you can look at maps in the back of your Bible or just Google it and see, what the landscape looked like during biblical times or during the time of the New Testament particularly. You had Judea, then you had Samaria, and then north of Samaria is Galilee. And Jesus did a lot of ministry in Galilee. But he had to get from Judea to Galilee. Now, the Jews of that time, the Jews of 2,000 years ago over there in Judea, they would shudder at the thought of having to go through Samaria, whether they're going from Judea to Galilee or from Galilee to Judea. But even the Judean Jews considered the Galileans to be second-class citizens. They didn't consider the Samaritans at all. If you think about when Peter and others were standing before the Sanhedrin, and they note that these men were Galileans, and they were amazed that they were talking intelligently. Aren't these guys Galileans? How are they so smart? And then they realized, hey, these guys had been with Jesus. But also Jesus coming out of Nazareth, it said, does anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth was considered like the worst part of Galilee by those in Judea. But they had no problem going to Galilee and doing business and visiting family and engaging, and also people in Galilee coming down to Judea for the feasts and the festivals and so forth at the temple in Jerusalem. But what they would do is go around. They would rather cross the Jordan and go through the provinces on the east side of the Jordan and then cut back over to Galilee, the province of Galilee. And the funny thing is, those folks on the other side were Gentiles. Nothing to do with worshiping the true God. At least those Samaritans were worshiping the God of Abraham. They were doing it on the mountain, and that's part of the conversation the lady has with Jesus. But here Jesus, as they're getting ready to leave to go to Galilee, he tells his disciples, we must go through Samaria. And they're like, well, why are we going through Samaria? Jesus said, we must go. So they shut up and they follow Jesus into Samaria. Now, when a Jew was in a hurry and had to go through Samaria, normally they wouldn't go into any of the cities, because the Jews' bigotry of the Samaritans back in that time, 2,000 years ago, was that even though these are their half-brothers, okay, these are their half-brothers. They're mixed with the Assyrians from the Assyrian captivity, but they're still the descendants of Abraham, just like the Jews are. They wouldn't even want to go in their cities. And if they had to pass by a Samaritan's house, they'd be sure to not even step in the shadow that the house casts. But here's Jesus. He says he's going to go through, and then he stops by a well, sends his disciples into the nearby city to get food, which I'm sure they didn't want to do, but when Jesus tells you to do something, you do it. And he sends them in to do that, and here comes the lady to draw water. And she's coming during the heat of the day. Now, most of the women would come out together in the morning. But because of the nature of this lady's life, she's not included in the circle of the other women who have their husband and have a proper marriage. See, this woman had had several husbands and was currently living with a man who was not her husband. And Jesus tells her that. That's what she goes and tells the people after this encounter back in the city. Come and see a man who has told me everything I've ever done. Could this be the Messiah? Here's a lady rejected by her culture. Here's a lady that is shunned by her neighbors. Here's a lady that no self-respecting Jew would talk to. But Jesus starts a conversation. Hey, would you be so kind as to draw me some water to drink? That throws her off. Why are you talking to me? Because she wouldn't normally even be acknowledged by a Jew, even if she was a good Samaritan. Wouldn't even be acknowledged. Why are you talking to me? Nobody talks to me. Nobody gives me the time of day. But Jesus starts the conversation. And he directs that conversation as they are talking about living water, life-giving, the source of life, the source of eternal life, which is ultimately Jesus. You see, he looked at somebody in their dire circumstances, looked at somebody who'd been beaten down by life, looked at somebody who had been rejected by everybody around her. But he chose to treat her like a human being, to treat her like everybody else. You see, that's what we're called to do as Christians. If we want to claim Christianity, if we want to claim to truly be a disciple of Christ, well, we better check how we are engaging people. In about the last third of Matthew chapter 25, I just did a sermon on this the past Sunday. There, Jesus talks about abiding in him. And he talks about those sheep and those goats and separating the sheep from the goats. And when he talks about that, he gets into this dialogue about, hey, to the sheep, you gave me a cup of water. You visited me. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked, you clothed me. To the goats, hey, I was these things and you didn't. You didn't give me drink. You didn't give me food. You didn't give me clothes. You didn't visit me in my distress. And they both asked the same question. When did that happen? Well, when you didn't do it for these, the least of my brethren. Later, he just says the least of these when he's addressing the goats. We need to look at the people around us, that society, that humanity, that our culture has basically labeled the least. Maybe economically, they're the least. Maybe socially, they're the least. But the people that are disregarded, we, as disciples of Christ, need to fix our eyes on them. we need to engage them. We need to talk to them. We need to interact with them. We need to really find what their needs are and minister to those needs. Because in ministering to those needs, we find opportunity to plant the seed of God's truth, the seed of God's love, the seed of the gospel that brings salvation. And after that seed is planted, our continued connection with that individual. I strongly advise people to avoid the one and done. Avoid the one and done. Because once you do the one and done, there's no more influence. Engage that person. See what you can do for that person. See how you can help that person go from where they are in life to where they need to be in life. And I tell you, that takes more than a single chanced encounter. You got to stay with that person. Work with that person. Help them get to a better place mentally, emotionally, a better place on their path of life. But the best place that you can help them get to is into the body of Christ, into that covenant that Jesus bought with his blood, that covenant that, as it talks about in Colossians chapter 1, reconciles us back to God, so that they can have a joy, as Peter puts it, that is inexpressible. A joy that radiates through all of your life in spite of being grieved by current trials. All that's in the opening of 1 Peter. And so, as we go through this holiday season, be merry, be joyful, be happy. Enjoy the blessings that God has given you. Remember Jesus, but hopefully you're remembering him every day. Hopefully you're celebrating him every day. And hopefully you're celebrating him in the best way you possibly can, and that is by living according to his example, walking in his ways, ministering to others as he ministered to others. Oh yeah, we can't pay the price for their sins, but we can show them that the price has been paid. We can clothe, we can feed, we can provide that simple cup of water. We can provide that human touch. We can give humanity, mercy, grace, forgiveness, comfort, encouragement. All these things are gifts this time of year that we should freely be giving to others. These are gifts that every day of the year, whenever the opportunity presents itself, we should be giving to others. Well, we're running close to the end of our time on our program today, and I hope all of you tomorrow have a Merry Christmas. And I hope that God blesses you with an opportunity to make somebody else's Christmas merry as well. The next time we're on the air, it's going to be New Year's Eve. The year is already over. And I want you, if you have any suggestions, any comments regarding content that we can look at in the new year, hey, just get on there and send an email to connect@cogitations.net. Connect@cogitations.net, and I'd be happy to just break down and to look at and to discuss and to talk about whatever topics interest you. When we tune in next Sunday morning at 9 a.m. on 106.1 The Flip FM for that episode of Cogitations, we're going to give some thought to the new year that is ahead of us and all the hope and all the promise that it contains. Until then, may God keep you, may God bless you, may God comfort you, may God encourage you, and may God give you an opportunity to be a minister and minister to others.
Tune in next Sunday at 9 for another edition of Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.